For as long as I can remember, my grandparents' cabin has been a real haven for the family. I spent a number of summers up there. We had small parties and get-togethers there, and it was one of my favorite places all throughout my childhood. It was nestled in the woods, and was pretty much perfect for a group of kids looking for some innocent fun. Well, and some not so innocent fun as we got a bit older. It was one of those rare weekends where my brother and I decided that we were going to stay up at my grandparents' cabin. I was 19 and still at home. Ben was 17, and while we were both pretty much adults, we still had to have permission to stay, just in case. Thankfully, everyone was okay with it, and we were told that we just needed to not get too rowdy or destroy anything. We agreed, and then immediately invited a few friends over that had access to alcohol. We figured as long as we just stayed at and in the cabin, everything would be fine, and we weren't likely to cause too much damage to anything. Of course, as the night grew on, some of the guys got a bit stupid, and after a while an idea hit Ben, which is never a good thing. Not for Ben. He stood up and loudly proclaimed, "Let's have a bonfire." I could tell by the fact that he slurred the first half of this sentence into one word that it was going to be a terrible idea. Ben always was a lightweight, and at 17, he was already loopy after 2 beers. He looked at me with that mischievous little twinkle in his eye, and then pointed at me saying, "You, go get some firewood." To which I responded, "Ben, that is a terrible idea." He frowned and asked why, and I motioned to the fact that we were sitting outside on dead grass and logs, and basically said that the woods around us were just a potential tinderbox. Ben scoffed and waved me off, trying to tell me that I was being a wimp, but I put my foot down on this one. I was okay with stupidity, but I wasn't okay with him burning the cabin down. I told him no fires and that if he started one, I would kick his ass. He grumbled, but eventually agreed and sat back down. We had a bit more back and forth before it started to get too late for me, and I decided to call it a night. I told the guys that I was headed in and pointed to Ben saying, "Don't do it." He laughed and said that he wouldn't, and, well, I thought that was that. I went in, threw myself on the couch, and passed out pretty hard. After a little while, I started hearing someone screaming, but half drunk, I thought that I was just having a dream. Until I heard someone scream my name, and the sound of distant sirens wailing through the woods. Panic surged through me as I jumped off the couch and ran outside. My heart skipped as my worst fears were confirmed, and I took in the chaos in front of me. There, a few feet from our gathering spot, a bonfire was raging out of control. The fire had danced its way from the small pit where it had started, and was spreading rapidly into the dense woods. The wind, just as I had feared, was carrying the small embers away, and it had pretty clearly spread this bonfire into what could become a catastrophic forest fire. And amidst the chaos in front of me was Ben, his face pale and his eyes wide with terror. Thankfully, the local fire department was there quickly, and they worked like crazy to control the blaze as it grew. It took them a couple of hours to completely douse the fire, preventing a disaster that could have easily consumed the cabin and destroyed a lot of the land. Even after all was said and done, the only thing that you could smell was that stench of burnt wood. Ben later told me that he'd waited all of 30 minutes before he started the fire, thinking that he could control it. He honestly could not have been more wrong. We surveyed the area to see how much damage it had done, and to see where the fire had spread, and it hit Ben pretty quickly that, had the fire gone on for literally a couple more minutes, the cabin would have been completely consumed. There was a section that was actually charred, that I would say was less than 5 feet from the rear wall. It would have caught, and it would have gone up like nothing. This place wasn't built like a house. It was just a small wooden cabin. There was nothing to stop it from burning like a pile of cheap wood because that's what it was. After that day, we weren't allowed back at the cabin. Like, at all. My grandparents still hold this against us, and rightfully so. And we haven't been back up there since. Unless our mom or dad are with us, or they are there. Nothing like being in your late 20s and having to be escorted by your parents because they can't trust you to be on their property alone. So, the lesson from this incident? Well, first off, my dear brother learned that he should listen to me when I tell him that his ideas are stupid, and dry summers are bad when it comes to fires. And for anyone out there that thinks that things like this can't happen to them, I have a short but effective word of warning for you. Disaster doesn't knock before it kicks in your door. Don't be like Ben. Take your surroundings into consideration, and don't think that you can control things like fire. Nature does not like being controlled. I guess some people have to learn the hard way like my brother did. Even today, whenever I smell wood burning, I think of that scene with Ben standing in the woods staring at me like I messed up, while the fire just rages behind him. It's a stark reminder for me how a moment's stupidity can lead to a potential disaster. I've always been an outdoorsy person. The wide open sky, the rustling of leaves in the wind, the chirping of crickets, all of it makes me feel alive and free. My friends share the same sentiment, and thus our group excursions to remote areas for camping and bonfire parties were quite frequent. We would typically set a date in the early autumn for the first one, and get together to spend the entire weekend just living life. But there was one trip that was unlike the others, and it was not for good reasons. It was that time of year when the leaves started to turn golden, right as the weather starts to shift slightly in the direction of winter. We decided to venture out into the forests of northern Maine, where our friend's family owned a small cabin. The cabin was rustic and cozy, and we all called it Harmony Hollow, a cheesy name that our DM had made up for a town in our D&D campaign. The cabin had a good amount of land attached to it, and it was definitely our go-to for autumn parties. We arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon, just as the sun was starting to set. The air was crisp and cool, the leaves were blowing around in the wind. We could hear the sound of a nearby stream, and the smell of wood smoke filled the air. The first night was pretty normal. We'd set up a pit for the fire, but had decided against actually having one, mostly because by the time we were all comfortable in the cabin, it was already pretty late. Plus, it just wasn't quite there temperature-wise to sit around a fire. However, on the second night of our stay there at Harmony Hollow, we decided that it was cool enough to have that bonfire. The chill was just starting to settle in, and there's something that's incredibly appealing about just sitting around a contained fire throughout the night. We got all the firewood and branches that we could, and we set up a decent-sized bonfire. Nothing too crazy, but large enough that it would burn for probably a couple of hours, at least until we all hit a wall and wanted to go to bed. We sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. We talked about how things were going for us, how things had been since last year when we met up like this. It must have been around midnight when our laughter and merriment was cut short by a really harsh and cold wind sweeping across our little setup. I started to shiver despite the fact that I was wearing a jacket and sitting by the fire. Brian made a comment that it was really quiet out that night, other than us, and we all kind of paused to listen. He was right. It was nearly silent out in the woods. There weren't any real crickets chirping, no owls hooting. It had gotten to the point where it was completely silent out. I started to say that it was getting late and that we should probably get to bed when Jen made a comment. Something like, "Wait, who is that?" The entire group quickly looked over to the woods in the direction that she was staring, and we all saw what she saw. There was a dimly lit silhouette of a man just slowly taking steps out of the tree line in our direction. We all froze as we watched this guy walk our way, each step crunching leaves under his feet in an almost unnaturally loud way. He paused somewhere around 15 feet from us and just stared at us, the fire barely illuminating his face. He was, to say it politely, rather grizzled looking. His hair was unkempt, and he had a beard that was very overgrown. His clothes looked dirty and torn, and his eyes were sunken sockets that were barely visible in the light of the flames. He didn't say anything at first, just standing there staring at us and the fire. There was a very uncomfortable pause before Brian stood up and asked if this guy was okay. The man didn't respond. He just continued to stare. His unsettling presence and the unnerving silence of the forest made this whole scene feel more isolating than ever. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man pointed toward our fire and uttered one word. He literally just said, "Danger," in a raspy and deep tone, and then turned and started walking back into the forest. We all just sat there and watched as this guy disappeared back into the woods. Now, I'm pretty sure that I've seen every horror movie that's been made in the last decade. And I know for a fact that when a creepy homeless-looking guy comes out of the woods and tells you something is a danger, you listen. I immediately stood up and started putting out the fire, much to the disappointment of my friends. Jen asked why I was putting it out, and I said, because he said that it was dangerous. Besides, we should all go to bed anyways. After some annoyance and grumbling, they all agreed that we should probably call it. That next morning, we woke up to the sound of sirens and went outside to see what was going on. When we got outside, we saw fire trucks and forestry service racing down the road. Come to find out, a small wildfire had broken out in the early hours of the morning, a little further north from our cabin. It had spread into the deep underbrush, but they were able to quickly get it under control, and thankfully not much damage was done. We were all safe. Our cabin was untouched, but I couldn't help but think that if we had left our fire burning, would we have started a fire like that? Was he somehow warning us? Did he set the fire, and he was telling us to put ours out so that we didn't look guilty? Or was this more likely just some weird and chilling coincidence? We never saw that man again, and all of our questions remained unanswered. We still go up to the cabin to have our parties, but we've set a hard rule since that night to have the fire out by midnight, just in case. We've decided that we don't want to see that man, whoever he was, ever again. Okay, so this is the story of the weirdest, most surreal event of my life. It happened during a camping trip that my girlfriend at the time, now wife, went on while we were still a pretty fresh couple. I think at the time we had only been together for about a year. That summer, my girlfriend and I decided to go out into the woods and just have a lovely little camping trip. We found our perfect spot, an open section of the woods with a huge open section of sky, and we set up our tents. As the sun started to set, we lit a cozy campfire and we were sitting there just enjoying the gorgeous night, cuddling up, sitting on our plush blanket and loving this romantic evening. Out of seemingly nowhere, a man wearing a ski mask and holding a gun stepped into the light of our campfire. He approached slowly, and I think that we both didn't realize that he was there at first, but when we noticed him, we both jumped up and entered into a state of panic. We both froze in fear, me saying, "Whoa, please, we don't have anything," thinking that this guy was just here to rob us. The man quickly tried to defuse the situation, saying, Hey, settle down. I'm not going to hurt either one of you if you just do what I ask, okay?" He then motioned for us to sit back down, and we both kind of looked at each other like, do we do what he wants? He actually answered that question for us, saying, "Look, just sit down, relax, let's just enjoy the night, and everything will be okay. I just need you to sit down and relax." I looked over and nodded at my girlfriend, and we went to sit back down on the blanket, and I pulled her down with me. He nodded, and then took a seat in one of our cloth lawn chairs, sitting across from us by the fire. After a few seconds, he motioned towards the cooler by me and asked if we had any beer. I said that we did, and he asked for one. I cautiously handed him one, and the three of us just kind of sat there in this really awkward silence. He broke the silence after a bit, asking me my name. I told him that my name was Todd, which it is, and he responded with, "It's very nice to meet you, Todd." And he then asked me what I did for a living. I mentioned that I was a desktop support guy for a company. He asked what that meant, and I explained that I was basically the guy that set up all the computers for the company's employees. He nodded and smiled, saying that it sounded kind of boring. I actually chuckled at this and said, "Yeah, it kind of is, but hey, it pays our rent." He nodded again and then said, "Oh, here's to that," and then took a drink. And then he looked at my girlfriend and asked her the same question. She told him her name and mentioned that she was going to school to be a nurse. He almost looked excited to hear this and then said, "My mom was a nurse. It's stressful, but she loved it. You'll do great." We sat there for about half an hour just engaging in this bizarre small talk, with this masked stranger holding a gun in his right hand and a half-empty beer in his left. After talking a bit more about what we did for work, our hobbies and all that, he starts to laugh and then shares a story about his brother. He tells us that this one time his brother was trying to light a bonfire, like ours, and he ended up setting himself on fire. He said that he ran around screaming like an idiot, and that he had to dump a cooler that they had full of chunks of ice and beer cans on him to put out the fire. It was surreal. This guy was sitting there, laughing, sharing this story as if we were best friends at a little reunion, acting as if he wasn't masked and basically holding us hostage. After about an hour had passed, he ended up standing up and thanking us for the beer. We were both stunned at how, I guess friendly is the right word, how friendly he was to us. He mentioned that it was getting late and that we should probably get to sleep, and then casually started just strolling away. Before he left the campsite, he stopped and turned back toward us, waving his gun in our direction, and said, "Oh, and I don't know if it's obvious, but I was never here, right? We nodded, too shocked to really say anything, and he just said, "Good. Have a good night, guys." Just like that, he was gone, leaving us in the glow of our little fire, shaking and thinking, what the hell was that? I still have no idea what actually happened that night. Was he on the run? Had he just committed a crime and was just hiding out for a while? Was this just some kind of messed up prank, possibly? We can really only speculate, but what I did know is that this experience is certainly one for the books. It's a story that she and I share with new friends, mostly because of how absurd it is, and how much it sounds like a small scene from some kind of horror movie. I will say that he was a very nice guy, minus the obvious, and that I'm more than grateful that he kept his word. He could have shot us. He could have attacked us. He could have done so many things, but he seemed like he just needed a spot to stop for a while. And if he was going to be there, he figured he may as well have a drink and make some small talk. Now, despite how polite he may have been, I really hope that we never meet again. I have a strange story to share that has bothered me for quite a while, but I really don't think I'll ever get any answers for it. I've been a police officer for around 12 years now, and I've seen some pretty strange things, but this one incident has always stuck with me. It still haunts my mind when I'm out on the night shifts and just driving through the silent streets. It was a call that seemed pretty routine, but quickly turned into an eerie enigma that's left me with more questions than answers. I was working the afternoon shift one summer, back when I had just started on the force. It was a fairly slow day. I don't live in a part of the country where big events happen frequently. It's normally pretty relaxed here. I remember that the air was really heavy and languid that day. The weather was hot and humid, and there weren't any clouds, which really dulled down the whole routine. Nobody wants to do anything, much less commit crimes, on days where you can barely breathe, which is something I actually appreciate. I don't want to run and chase people, and they don't want to do anything bad. It's like a mutual agreement that those days are not for us. Anyways, I was cruising along and I got a call from dispatch saying that they needed me to go to one of the rental cabins on the outskirts of town. These cabins were owned by a real estate company, and they basically rented them out for a few weeks to a few months at a time. And we never got calls to go out there, so this was even more shocking to me. The call explained that there was a man that was claiming someone had broken into his cabin. He reported that he was on a day trip, and when he got back, he found a fire in the bonfire pit burning in his front yard of the cabin that he had left secured and vacant the entire day. They mentioned that he hadn't gone into the cabin since returning, so somebody could still be inside the cabin, and he needed someone there to clear the scene. It was a peculiar call, but it definitely warranted our attention. When my partner and I arrived, we found the man standing outside behind a minivan in the driveway. He looked nervous, frantic. His eyes were kind of darting around and he was pacing behind the car, visibly agitated. When we stepped out, I could see the bonfire still burning, though it was mostly just embers at this point. There was this acrid smell of burning materials hanging in the air. What materials, I have no idea, but it wasn't pleasant. That much I remember. We approached the man cautiously, and he explained everything to us a second time. but then mentioned that he thought someone was still in the cabin because the door was open. We approached cautiously, hands over our holsters, and every step I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. We entered slowly and cleared room by room, but there was no one inside, though it had absolutely been ransacked. Furniture was overturned, drawers were open, and items were randomly scattered all over the place. We came back outside and told him that it was clear, but that it was a mess. We asked him if he had left it like that, which may sound like a dumb question, but you'd be surprised. He told us that he hadn't, that he'd kept it clean and in good order so that he could get his deposit back. After a bit of investigating, we determined that there was definitely remnants of things from the cabin in the fire. Photos, clothing, documents, all charred beyond recognition. It was really bizarre, as if someone was destroying personal belongings, but why? We tried to piece together some of the puzzle, asking the man if he had any enemies or if he'd been in any disputes. He said no. We asked him if he'd been involved in any illegal activity, mentioning that his honesty was important for his own protection at this point, and he was adamant that he hadn't done anything. He mentioned that he'd literally only been there for 3 days at this point, and that his clothing was still in his bag because he hadn't been there long enough to even really unpack most of his stuff. The incident was perplexing, to say the least. Looking at the possibilities, none of them really fit. If the man had started the fire to destroy something himself, why would he call us? Fires were not restricted at that point in time, so we wouldn't have had to cover for it or anything. I supposed that he could have been trying to do some sort of obscure insurance fraud claim, and he needed the police report, but there was nothing in the fire that we saw that was worth anything. Just clothing and paper. But then, if it wasn't him, who was it? What was the purpose of burning things from the cabin? We did our investigation on the cabin, fingerprinting, interviewing some of the residents of the next door cabins, and did everything that we could to get more information. But there was nothing. It was as if the fire starter had vanished without a trace, and no one knew why it had happened. In the end, we had to just let it go, and to let it go cold. The mystery of who broke into the cabin and started the fire remained unsolved. There was no evidence that this guy had done anything to deserve it. He hadn't made anyone mad. He hadn't even been in the cabin more than a few days. As mentioned, it's still one of those things that pops up in my mind now and again, because it just made no sense, and there were no answers. Odds are, we're never going to have an answer for it, because it was such a small, isolated, and weird incident that happened in a very cut-off part of the town. So, that, my friends, was a burning hot collection of scary bonfire stories, or stories that involved a bonfire. I will admit that one of them was technically a campfire. I'm sorry if you were all disappointed and ashamed of me for including it in this collection, but we're gonna pretend it was a bonfire. What really constitutes a bonfire anyways? A fire with people around it? In that case, it's a bonfire. Anyways, fantastic collection of stories involving fires. Good, scary collection. The cabin one, I'm glad that one didn't end badly, because as I read that story the first time, I genuinely anticipated it to burn the cabin, because cabins in the woods, whenever they're just small, like, prefab cabins, which is what I'm assuming that person's cabin is, since They said it was basically a cheap pile of wood. They are not solid. The wood that exists in the structure typically is pretty low quality. I'm not saying it's like terrible, it's not like a log cabin style, it's just planks, basically. So that one was scary. It could have gotten much worse, but it was definitely scary. Hopefully Ben learned his lesson in that situation. The creepy man with the warning, the masked guy at the campfire with a gun, those were creepy. I agree with MaxChar, I'm not sure how that's pronounced, but I agree with them about the if a creepy man walks out of the woods and says your fire is dangerous, you should probably put it out. So, and then Todd's story with the masked man at the campfire, genuinely terrifying situation. And then the last one, I don't know what to think of that. That's an odd story. So, hopefully you all enjoyed them. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you're new to the channel and liked what you heard, please consider subscribing. It would mean the world to me. And you can also do things such as joining Patreon or the super thanks. Joining memberships and Patreons get you early access to my content like this and other stuff, depending on which side you sign up for. Never expected, always appreciated. And then the last thing that you can do is go down below the video and leave me a comment. It can be anything from a simple hello to a story that you once had, or a story that you have about a fire. That sentence broke. That sentence broke my brain. I'm done. I hope you all have a beautiful day. I hope you remember you are loved, you are valid, you are important. You're the best you that you can be. Never let anyone tell you otherwise, and please don't forget it. And until next time, my friends, much love, and sleep well.